She goes by many names: Elizabeth Cavendish, Elizabeth Talbot, the Countess of Shrewsbury, but is perhaps best known as Bess of Hardwick. A formidable, astute and impressive figure, Bess would become infamous not only for her notable position at the court of Elizabeth I, but also as something else entirely, something unusual for a woman of the time, for Bess of Hardwick was a businesswoman. Via her marriages and astute business acumen, she would become one of the wealthiest people of the late 16th and early 17th century. The eagle-eyed may have even spotted a portrait of her hanging on the halls of Hogwarts in the Harry Potter film series. Although not born to great wealth or even a great name, she would become one of the most significant women of Elizabeth I's reign, and would also count two prominent claimants to the throne as members of her own family, one related by blood, her granddaughter Arbella Stuart, and another, Henry Lord Darnley, via her daughter's marriage. But who actually was Bess of Hardwick? How did she become such a key figure in the reign of Elizabeth I? And what exactly were these business ventures that in many ways broke the mould for a woman of the time? Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 59, Bess of Hardwick, a Tudor businesswoman. Born Elizabeth Hardwick, Bess was the daughter of John Hardwick by his wife Elizabeth Leake, daughter of Thomas Leake and Margaret Fox. The family hailed from Derbyshire in the English Midlands, where the magnificent Hardwick Hall, built for and by Bess, still stands to this day. A monument to Bess's colossal wealth, Hardwick Hall became infamous for its exceptionally large windows, which led to many saying Hardwick Hall is more glass than wall. Another Harry Potter tidbit for those who have seen the films, Malfoy Manor, the family home of, as you can probably guess, the Malfoy family, seen in the penultimate Harry Potter film, is based on Hardwick Hall. Anyway, back to Bess. Her exact date of birth is unknown, but likely occurred sometime between 1521 and 1527. With that said, according to Bess herself, who under a witness statement under oath at a court hearing in October 1546, gives her age at the time of her first marriage in May 1543 as being of tender years, and this in the 16th century indicated someone under the age of 16, and thus this would indicate that Bess was born at the later end of that window, probably around 1527. We know it cannot be later than 1527 because of the date of her father's death given in his Inquisition post-mortem. The Hardwick family had arrived in Derbyshire from Sussex on the southern coast of England by the mid-13th century and farmed land granted by Robert Savage, Lord of the Manor of Stainsbury on the north-east border of Derbyshire overlooking Nottinghamshire. By the mid-15th century, the family had risen to gentleman yeoman stock, with an estate of a few hundred acres located mainly in the parish of Alt Hucknall in the Manor of Stainsbury. The Hardwick coat of arms was probably granted around 1450 to William Hardwick, a great-grandfather of Bess. We can confidently say that this is the date because in 1569, Bess's one and only brother, James, when giving evidence to his right to the Hardwick arms, provided the heralds with a pedigree of his family, which began with William, who had died in 1453. James Hardwick was the last of the surviving legitimate male members of the Hardwick family. By the time of Bess's birth, the Hardwicks were members of the minor gentry of Scarsdale, but notably no male member of the Hardwick family ever rose above the status of esquire or held any important local or county offices such as justices of the peace, roles normally given to the younger sons of middling nobles. Again, this sort of stresses the Hardwicks' humble beginnings. Bess's father John died aged about 40, leaving behind his widow Elizabeth and 5 children, his son and heir, the aforementioned James, and the couple's 4 daughters, Elizabeth, Mary, Jane and Alice. Sadly, the order in which these children were born is lost to us. As was customary, Elizabeth Hardwick soon remarried, choosing as her second husband Ralph Leake, the second son of the neighbouring Leake family of Chatsworth in Derbyshire. This union would result in 3 further daughters, thus 3 half-siblings for young Bess and her siblings. In 1543, Bess married the 13-year-old Robert Barlow, heir to a neighbouring estate. As to be expected, the exact date of her marriage to Robert is unknown. It is thought that the marriage took place in late May 1543, shortly before the death of Robert's father on the 28th of May. There is no evidence that they lived together as husband and wife, and the marriage would be a short-lived one, with Robert dying at the end of December 1544, during which time no children had been born to the couple. Given the relatively humble nature of both Bess and Robert, at this time at least, it is probable that the marriage had been arranged locally, likely to mitigate the impact of wardship on the Barlow estate should Robert succeed his father as an underage heir, which was an all too common occurrence. The marital claims to Robert's estate were disputed, and following his death, Bess was refused her dower rights. It is here that we first see some of Bess's own mettle. She was no ordinary 16th century widow and took the matter to court, which resulted in Bess being awarded her claim on the Barlow estate and compensation for good measure. This had happened when Bess was roughly 17 years old, putting greater emphasis still on how exceptional she was. 3 years later, at the age of 20, or thereabouts, on the 20th of August 1547, Bess married the twice-widowed Sir William Cavendish, Treasurer of the King's Chamber, and via that marriage would earn her her first title, becoming Lady Cavendish. The wedding took place at 2 o'clock in the morning, which was very early but not that unusual, at the home of the Grey family, who were close friends of the couple. Sir William was more than twice Bess's age, and the father of 2 daughters. His fortune had been made following the dissolution of the monasteries, since as an official of the Court of Augmentations, he was able to select choice properties for himself. That Bess married a man who played a large role in the dissolution tells us much about her own religious leanings. It's also reasonable to conclude that it was from Sir William that she honed the skills that she would later put to good use as a businesswoman in her own right. Possibly acting on Bess's advice, Sir William sold his lands in the south of England and bought the Chatsworth estate in her home county of Derbyshire. The couple would have 8 children, of which 6 reached adulthood. Their firstborn, a daughter Frances, came along in June 1548. Another daughter, Temperance, followed the next year but sadly died in infancy. Their third child, a son, Henry, was born in 1550, and although a godson of the future Elizabeth I, he would grow up to have an extremely strained relationship with his mother Bess. Indeed, Bess once referred to him as "my bad son Henry." Her second son, William, was an altogether different character. Born in 1552, he would grow to be the very embodiment of a good and solid courtier, achieving fine titles along the way, and indeed his descendants, who now boast the very grand Dukedom of Devonshire, are among the highest remaining members of the English nobility still around today. Following William, Bess gave birth to another son, Charles, who would be a godson of Queen Mary I, and the forebear of the short-lived Dukedom of Newcastle upon Tyne. Bess's 6th child and second living daughter, Elizabeth, would be the one who had the largest impact on the court of Queen Elizabeth I. In 1574, so we're jumping ahead somewhat here, Bess arranged a marriage between Elizabeth and the second son of the Countess of Lennox, Margaret Douglas. This was a significant match for Bess to land, because Margaret Douglas was a member of the royal family, being the daughter of Margaret Tudor, Queen Dowager of Scotland, and thus a sister of Henry VIII and a daughter of Henry VII, also making Margaret Douglas Queen Elizabeth I's first cousin. Margaret's son, Charles Stuart, was thus a great-grandson of King Henry VII. In marrying her daughter to Charles Stuart, Bess was tying herself to the royal family, for any children that Elizabeth would have would carry Tudor blood in their veins, thus placing them, technically at least, in the line of succession. With Elizabeth I, both unmarried and childless, she was extremely touchy about the rise of potential royal heirs. We need only look at her treatment of the younger Grey sisters when they made clandestine marriages, for example. By 1574, Bess was married to her fourth husband, the Earl of Shrewsbury. The marriage ceremony took place without the knowledge of the Earl, who, though well aware of the suggestive match sometime prior to this event, declined to accept any responsibility. Due to the Lennox family's claim to the throne, the marriage was considered potentially treasonable, since Queen Elizabeth's consent had not been obtained. Margaret Douglas, mother of the bridegroom, was sent to the Tower for several months, something the Queen likely got a kick out of. The two cousins had never been close, with Margaret Douglas devoted to Elizabeth's direct predecessor, her half-sister, Queen Mary. Bess was ordered to London to face an official inquiry, but with incredible bravery and more than a touch of defiance, she simply ignored the summons and remained in Sheffield in the north of England until the row died down. Anyway, back to the final of Bess's own pregnancies, which is believed to have resulted in twin girls born in January 1556, Mary and Lucrece. Sadly, little Lucrece died within the year, but her twin, Mary, would reach adulthood. Following the death of one of her twins, further sadness was not far off for Bess, for in the autumn of 1557, Sir William Cavendish died. The couple's marriage had been happy and successful, but given the vast age difference between the two, it had been expected that Bess would outlive Sir William. But even so, to be widowed twice by the age of 30 and with 6 children to raise was certainly an unwelcome position to be in, made worse by the fact that Sir William had been deeply in debt to the Crown. Upon his death, Bess claimed the sum of his properties, having insisted that his land be settled on their heirs and not the children that he had had from a former relationship. Doing as her mother had done before, Bess chose to marry again, this time to one Sir William St. Lo, thus she became Lady St. Lo. William was a wealthy widower in his own right and came with ancient noble pedigree. His fortune was thus a welcome security net given her former husband's aforementioned debts. The marriage took place in 1558 and brought Bess closer than she had ever been to both the royal court and its queen, Elizabeth I, for her new husband was captain of the guard to the Queen and had also served as chief butler of England, a role with much significance at royal coronations. Due to his relationship with Queen Elizabeth, he was able to reduce the debt that Bess owed and paid it back in full on her behalf. William owned large West Country estates at Tomarton in Gloucestershire and Chew Magna in Somerset, whilst his principal residence was at Sutton Court, also in the county of Somerset. 6 years into their marriage, Bess was widowed for a third time, for William died in 1564. Although not proven, it has long been suspected that he was poisoned by his younger brother, for William had no sons to follow him, and thus his vast wealth may have been bestowed on his brother. Had this been the hope of William's brother, then he was sorely mistaken, for instead everything was left to Bess. This made Bess an extremely wealthy woman, with an annual income valued at £60,000, roughly £25 million a year by modern standards. His connection to Elizabeth I had also paid major dividends, for during their marriage Bess had been made a lady of the bedchamber, giving her almost untrammelled access to the Queen, with whom she held great favour, perhaps explaining why Bess felt confident enough to ignore that request that she received a few years later following her daughter's scandalous marriage. The fact that Bess was now a widow, but an incredibly wealthy one, made her a desirable figure. She was, after all, still in her 30s, she had proven her fertility, she had retained her looks, and was both, as I say, extremely wealthy and counted the Queen as a close friend. Soon, notable courtiers coveted Bess as a potential wife. It would seem, however, that at this particular moment, Bess decided, to use modern parlance, to chill out. She was fabulously rich, she had many children, she'd been widowed 3 times already. She thus decided that for the time being at least, she would enjoy her great wealth and luxuriate in the freedom of being a single woman, in a court in which the very notion of such a status was viewed with scorn. She did eventually agree to another marriage, but not until 4 years later. This time she would marry as befitting the station that she now enjoyed, for her 4th husband was George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. Thus, Bess was instantly catapulted into the heart of the nobility, becoming the Countess of Shrewsbury. Bess's new husband was one of the premier aristocrats of the realm, and the father of 7 children by his first marriage. Indeed, 2 of his children were married to 2 of Bess's in a double ceremony in February 1568. Bess's daughter, Mary Cavendish, aged 12, was given in marriage to Shrewsbury's eldest son, Gilbert, aged 16, which would mean that hopefully in time her daughter would also follow as Countess of Shrewsbury, while Bess's son, Sir Henry Cavendish, aged 18, married Shrewsbury's daughter, Lady Grace Talbot, aged 8. Before anyone freaks out, there was zero blood link between these two unions. It was not like the Targaryens. So whilst we would now think it's a bit weird for step-siblings to marry, back then it wasn't so out of the ordinary, particularly among the noble and the very rich. In the year before Bess and the Earl of Shrewsbury were married, a political disturbance arose in Scotland, which would profoundly affect their lives and the success of their marriage. Rebel Scottish lords rose up against Mary Queen of Scots. They imprisoned her and forced her to abdicate in favour of her 1-year-old infant son James. In May of 1568, Mary escaped captivity in Scotland and fled southwards towards England, seeking the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. However, the English authorities were not sure how to receive her. On the 18th of May, she was taken into protective custody at Carlisle Castle in Cumbria by local officials. Queen Elizabeth felt obliged to host and protect Mary. She was, after all, her cousin, and she was an anointed queen. However, due to Mary's persistent claim to the English throne, Elizabeth also regarded her as a natural threat. Elizabeth had Mary moved to Bolton Castle in Yorkshire, where she was lodged under the guard of Francis Knollys, pending the York Conference inquiry regarding Mary's fate. The inquiry results were inconclusive, yet Elizabeth did not set Mary free. Instead, Mary would be detained under the custody of the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury, aka Bess and hubby number 4. There may have been some awkwardness present, for it was believed that Mary had played a hand in the death of her second husband, Lord Darnley, who had been the older brother of Bess's son-in-law, Charles Stuart, and thus an uncle to Arbella Stuart, Bess's beloved granddaughter. Queen Elizabeth's instructions to Bess and her husband amounted to little more than Mary Queen of Scots being under house arrest. Mary reached her new residence, Tutbury Castle, in February 1569, when she was 26 years old, and would remain in the custody of the Shrewsburys for 15 years. Always open to lessening her own financial output, Queen Elizabeth shifted the cost of the imprisonment of Mary onto the Earl and Countess. It was recorded that Mary would use the couple's insecurities against each other, even convincing Talbot that Bess was stealing from him. Mary's presence in their home, as well as the financial costs and political tensions, may have contributed to the rift that eventually grew between Bess and her fourth husband, which would eventually lead to the breakdown of their marriage. While in the care of the Earl and Countess, Queen Mary lived at one or another of their many houses in the Midlands: Wingfield Manor, Chatsworth House, Tutbury, and Sheffield Manor. Throughout this period, Bess spent time as Mary's companion, working with her on embroidery and textile projects. Indeed, all of Mary's work later became part of Bess's historical collection at Hardwick Hall, and was also likely where Mary met and spent some time with Lady Arbella Stuart, Bess's granddaughter and a potential heiress to the throne of England. Mary was, after all, an aunt of the young Arbella, and would remember her in her will, leaving her niece her own Book of Hours. Bess's own relationship with Arbella, though once very strong, would deteriorate as the years passed. According to biographers of Bess of Hardwick, she was, understandably, a keen supporter of Arbella being Elizabeth I's heir apparent, for unlike the other chief claimant, James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, Arbella had been born in England, which had been decreed by Henry VIII was a prerequisite for anyone who would succeed his line. The lengths which Bess went to ensure Arbella remained both prominent and present included even technically imprisoning the young girl to prevent her from eloping. Arbella blamed her grandmother for this, and the two fell out irrevocably when Arbella attempted to run away and marry William Seymour, who, as a great-great-great-grandson of King Henry VII, also had a claim to the throne, thus doubling the prominence of Arbella, but arguably undercutting her position at the same time. This Bess could not stomach, and she cut Arbella from her will and begged the Queen to take her granddaughter off her hands. Arbella's royal claim was never truly recognised. Despite disinheriting Arbella and her eldest son Henry, who had aided Arbella's escape, Bess was later reconciled with her granddaughter, although their meeting was characterised as being lukewarm at best. In 1580, Bess and her fourth husband's marriage broke down irrevocably. Even Queen Elizabeth had tried to get them to reconcile, but to no avail. The long presence of Mary Queen of Scots seems to have aggravated, if not created, their problems by playing the couple off against each other. The Countess spread rumours that her husband Shrewsbury had been in a relationship with Mary, a charge which was never been proved or disproved, and in any case Bess would later retract, but seems unlikely given Shrewsbury's disposition and increasingly poor health. On his death in 1590, Bess became the Dowager Countess of Shrewsbury. She lived mostly at Hardwick, where she built the new grand mansion of Hardwick Hall, which still stands to this day and is one of the country's premier stately homes and certainly one of the most important survivors of the 16th century. By the turn of the 17th century, Bess was now in her 70s, a great age for the Tudors, and so she would have been forgiven for taking a back seat and properly chilling out. But not so. Instead, Bess decided the time was right to launch her own business venture, predominantly in the lending of money. Yep, Bess of Hardwick, Tudor badass, became, in effect, a 16th century mortgage lender. This was a time before banks and bank accounts. People had property and they had cash. Bess had a lot of both, but most people were desperately short on the latter. Buying up large swathes of land across the country, Bess would then mortgage them out, collecting interest at 10%. She would frequently lend money against land, bricks and mortar, and even used her granddaughter's position as a great heiress to aid her business ventures, for she once convinced a client to mortgage his property in Arbella's name, and so when he died, the 5 properties that had been his went to Arbella, and thus by extension Bess. Property and money were not the only business ventures, however. Thanks to her own vast lands, Bess set up a network of mines, thus providing her with an ample supply of rich mineral resources, which she would then sell on, no doubt with a decent profit margin on top. This would then extend to a series of glass-making workshops also. If Bess were alive in the 21st century, I think she definitely would have been a dragon on Dragon's Den. Given her advanced years, Bess looked to the future, not to her own self, but what she would leave behind, her legacy, as it were. In 1601, she ordered an inventory of her household furnishings, including textiles, at the 3 properties at Chatsworth, Hardwick and Chelsea, all of which survive to this day. In her will, she bequeathed these items to her heirs to be preserved in perpetuity. The 400-year-old collection, now known as the Hardwick Hall Textiles, is the largest collection of tapestry, embroidery, canvas work and other textiles to have been preserved by a single private family in Great Britain. It is a true, remarkable survivor when one considers how much we've lost over the years. She also looked to the future of the crown, and despite being older than Elizabeth I, would still be in robust health when the latter died in 1603. Perhaps owing to her Stuart connections, Bess developed an easy relationship with the first Stuart Queen Consort, Anne of Denmark, the wife of James I of England and VI of Scotland. Indeed, such was their friendship that Bess brought the new queen in on one of her planned business ventures, namely the founding of a university in Ripon in Yorkshire. Sadly, however, this would be a rare failure for Bess's part, for she and the Queen were unsuccessful in getting the university established. Time did, of course, eventually begin to creep up on Bess of Hardwick. In early 1608, now riddled with severe arthritis, she had become almost immobile, but she still had her wits about her despite being in her mid-80s, the equivalent, roughly speaking, of someone being about 110 by modern standards. She made one final update to her will, knowing that her time was running out, and died peacefully at 5 p.m. on Saturday the 13th of February 1608. At the time of her death, she was referred to as one of the richest and most powerful women in the kingdom. Her remains were interred on the 16th of February in a vault at the All Saints' Church in Derby, the county of her birth and beloved Hardwick Hall. The church was demolished in the 18th century, but in 1927 was expertly rebuilt and became Derby Cathedral. In life, she had organised a grand effigy created of her likeness with a laudatory inscription which she took care to actually have installed while she was still alive. This fine monument to Bess, an extraordinary woman, can still be seen by visitors to Derby Cathedral to this day. Bess truly was a remarkable figure. We so often call Anne Boleyn a woman ahead of her time, which is in part true, but Bess, I think, truly deserves such a title. Born to parents of no great wealth or status, she would end her days not only one of the richest women in England, with some accounts stating that she was actually the richest woman in England after the Queen herself, but also left behind a legacy in Hardwick Hall that is still seen by millions of tourists each year. Her story is one that we should all be much more well acquainted with, and so I hope today's episode will encourage you to go out and learn more about her incredible life and legacy. And so, that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. In next week's show, I'm thrilled to be welcoming back Sylvia Barbara Soberton onto the podcast for a discussion, quite apt for this time of year, all about witchcraft, and in particular accusations of witchcraft levelled against Anne Boleyn. That will drop next Thursday. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.